Hello, class. Now that we are into November and over the next month, roughly until December 6th, you will at some point need to do your Unit 3 multiple choice exam as the proctored event, of course. And there's also the essay portion. I figure now, since you are getting ready to do those, I should go ahead and review the quizzes from Unit 3. And by the way, I had a question about whether you needed to do since I have the multiple choice for Unit 3 and the essay split up into two different assignments. It doesn't matter if you do the essay portion before you or after you do the proctored multiple choice section. And basically, no, it doesn't matter. You can do the essay portion before you end up doing the proctored multiple choice section. Doesn't really matter. Um, but I thought I'd just clarify that since I had some questions about that. But yeah, I figure we will go ahead and take a look at some of these quizzes. And actually, I'm going to start off with the Lesson 8 quiz, even though that's part of Unit 2, because I haven't gone over this yet. Um, Let's see, question 1. When employers practiced welfare capitalism during the 1920s, they engaged in the practice of trying to make unions seem irrelevant by having the company itself provide benefits. That is the answer. It was not to support government subsidies for the unemployed, not to encourage employees to unionize. And since it's not either of those two, it can't be all of these answers combined. So it's this one right here. You know, the 1920s was a time when businesses were trying to get workers on the side of free market economics, uh, trying to get workers to back away from the idea of the progressive era of regulating business. This was also after the Red Scare, right after World War I, where the Soviet Union went communist. So businesses are trying to de-radicalize their workers and convince them that unions and radical political parties are not necessary in the first place because the companies themselves will take care of workers well enough. And the companies, American companies, were able to a greater extent than before, they were able to afford these programs because the U.S. was so prosperous in the 1920s. We had the war loans from World War I getting paid back with interest. So that was very helpful and made these company benefits possible for companies to do this and still turn a good profit. Let's see, question 2. Women were involved in all the following changes in the 1920s, except, so was there the flapper girl lifestyle trend? Yes. The 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote? Yes. Spread of pink collar job opportunities? Yes. The Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion? No, that comes in the 1970s. That's much later, so that is the exception. Question 3. The John Scopes trial, or Scopes monkey trial of 1927, centered around which of the following controversies? Was it gun control? No. Teaching of evolution? Yes. Penalties for illegal immigration? No. Disobedience against the draft? No. The draft was more of a controversy in the 19 teens during World War One. Some of these others are more kind of modern controversies, like gun control and illegal immigration. Question 4. All of the following leisure activities became more popular in the 1920s except, so was there listening to jazz music on the radio? Yes. Taking vacations via automobile? Yes. Watching jazz performers on the home television? No, that still comes a bit later in the 1950s. Dancing to jazz music in nightclubs? Yes. Question 5. Prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s resulted in all of the following except. So was illegal alcohol in the 1920s purer and safer to consume than before? No. So right there already we have our exception. But it did expand policing powers, did increase organized crime, and, well, did slightly reduce drinking in some regions of the country, but not as much as the prohibitionists were hoping for. And increasingly, the country, by the early 1930s, came to feel like the costs of policing outweighed the benefits. So when Franklin Roosevelt came into office, Roosevelt and Congress pushed for uh, overturning prohibition and letting alcohol flow again. Question 6. The revived Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s opposed blacks, yeah. Anyone who seemed to pose a challenge to traditional values, yes. Jews, Catholics, and other immigrant groups, yes. All of these answers combined, yes. Question 7. The Republican administrations of the 1920s pursued the economic policy of increasing government regulation of business? No. Increasing taxes? No. Encouraging worker-owned cooperatives, socialistic schemes? No. Not enforcing government regulations of businesses very strictly? Yes. They went back to a more free market approach, as did businesses themselves, or as with the encouragement of business, the business lobby. Like I said. Question 8. African Americans experienced all of the following changes in the 1920s, except an end to segregation in the South? No. That, at least legally speaking, comes later in the 1960s. But there was a growing popularity of jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, opportunities to migrate from the South to northern cities. Question 9. During the 1920s, all of the following factors had an unambiguously positive effect on the American economy, except innovations in automobile production? Yes. Low worldwide demand for American farm products? No. That had a negative effect on the American economy, not an unambiguously positive effect. But there were, interest repayments that were helpful and high consumer demand for durable goods like washing machines, refrigerators, automobiles, things of that sort. And question 10. Which of the following economic problems emerged in the late 1920s? Did business become smothered by more regulations? No. Consumers and businesses became more reliant on credit? Yes. Unsustainably so. Did stock market traders become less willing to borrow money? No, in fact, more willing. And did America leave the gold standard? No. In fact, Herbert Hoover attracted criticism because he staunchly kept with the gold standard. Even after the crash hit in 1929, which of course prevented him from expanding the money supply as much as some people wanted. Let me make sure. Yep, 10 out of 10. All right. Moving on to lesson 9 quiz. By the deepest point in the Great Depression in 1932, the average unemployment rate in the U.S. had reached 25%. Historians have pointed to all of the following as potential causes and or intensifiers of the Great Depression, except, so was there stock market speculation? Yes. Overproduction of agricultural and consumer goods relative to monetary demand? Yes. The 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act? Well, no. That would make sense because that's coming much after the Great Depression, and the start of it, 1929. So that would be our exception right there. Unsustainable indebtedness? Yes. So our exception is this one. Question 3. Herbert Hoover's responses to the Great Depression included all of the following, except, so did he sign the Smoot-Hawley tariff? Yes. Did he allow the Federal Reserve to restrict the growth of the dollar money supply? Yes. Did he agree to all of the demands of the bonus army? No. Of course, the bonus army wanted their World War I bonuses paid a little bit early to ease the burden of the Depression. Herbert Hoover said no, enlisted Douglas MacArthur to drive them away with bayonets and tanks, killed and injured a few of them. So that's the exception there. Hoover did institute the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but didn't really get enough funding to really do much on the large national scale. Question 4. In an attempt to solve the most critical problem of the economy, Roosevelt's first action after taking office was to call for the previous President Hoover to be charged with treason? No. Close all banks nationwide and pass the Emergency Banking Act? Yes. Put major industries under government control? No. Give every American citizen a cash grant? No. Question 5. Which of these is incorrectly paired? So, was the SEC to regulate the stock market? Yes. Was the Tennessee Valley Authority set up to crack down on lawlessness and banditry by increasing police presence in the Appalachian Mountains? No. This is our incorrect one right here. The Tennessee Valley Authority was set up to build electricity lines and hydroelectric dams and fertilizer plants, a bunch of different things in the Appalachian region. FDIC, protect against bank failures, yep. And Civilian Conservation Corps to work in conservation and reforestation, yes. So incorrect one is this one, the TVA. Question 6. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had all of the following critics who called for him to have the federal government do more to address the Great Depression and or redistribute wealth, except, so which of these would have not, wanted Roosevelt to do more? So you had the CIO, they did want him to do more. The Communist Party, they did want him to do more. Huey Long also wanted him to do more. The exception is the U.S. Supreme Court that thought he was already doing too much and was overstepping his constitutional powers through things like the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, just to name a couple. Which of the following New Deal acts or agencies was declared unconstitutional? So here we go. That would be the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The Resettlement Administration had to do with the Dust Bowl. And to a certain extent with the Depression as a whole, which already made it tough, but in particular the Dust Bowl. As that Grapes of Wrath excerpt, explained what they were going through. Question 9. Unemployment, unfortunately, did not decline continuously throughout Roosevelt's presidency. It did decline basically until World War II, but it did have a slight uptick in 1937. So that's the answer there. It increased consistently during Herbert Hoover's presidency. Question 10. Franklin Roosevelt shared which of the following characteristics with German leader Adolf Hitler? Both leaders thought it was important to personally communicate with their countries through speeches or radio broadcasts. Yes, here we go. That's the answer. These others should obviously seem not correct, right? Because Roosevelt did not loudly blame Jews for causing the Great Depression. Roosevelt did not have aggressive plans to get through the Great Depression by conquering and annexing neighboring countries. And Roosevelt did not have plans to immediately jumpstart industries with massive military spending. Those were all things distinct to Hitler's response to the Great Depression. So, yep, 10 out of 10. All right, moving on to Lesson 10. World War II. And here, this first question is about attitudes in the interwar period. It says, all the following were reasons for isolationist attitudes in the U.S. after World War I, except, so was there distaste for the experiences and outcomes of World War I? Yes. Right. Shell shock, and also Wilson's 14 points being completely ignored by Britain and France, and the actual Treaty of Versailles looking nothing like the lenient peace that Wilson had proposed. That left a bit of distaste in Americans' mouths about the whole thing. Was toleration of European fascists as anti-communists a reason for isolationist attitudes? Yes. Americans thought, well, how bad can Hitler be if he's opposing the Soviet Union and verbally attacking them and saying that someday he's going to physically attack them? Isn't that a good thing that he's going to attack these communists? And he's attacking and jailing the communists in his own country. Isn't that a good thing? A lot of Americans thought. Sympathy for the Soviet Union. No, that's one thing you could not really, say is true about most Americans at the time. Were Americans distracted with the Great Depression at home? Yes, yes. So the exception is this one right here. Question 2, which aspect of Japanese aggression occurred last in the lead up to World War II? That would be the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Right, because first comes invasion of Manchuria, then the invasion of rest of China with the rape of Nanking, then the invasion of some of the other European colonies like French Indochina or Vietnam, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor. Question 3, which aspect of German aggression occurred last? That would be Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. That's in 1941. Poland's 1939. Annex of this region of Czechoslovakia is 1938. Germany's takeover of all of Czechoslovakia is in early 1939. So basically you have, in chronological order, this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. So this is the one that occurred last. Britain's policy of allowing Germany to annex a limited amount of territory in return for promises of future peaceful relations was known as appeasement. Right, the Neutrality Acts were things where the U.S. tried to stay out of the Spanish Civil War and other conflicts that were brewing in the 1930s. Operation Sea Lion was Hitler's aborted plan to invade Britain, and Lend-Lease was Roosevelt's plan to start sending supplies to Britain even before the U.S. entered the war. Question 5. The country that lost the most soldiers in fighting the Axis powers was the Soviet Union, by far. Which step did America's military take first in the European theater of World War II? That would be the liberation of North Africa. Liberation of Italy then came next, then the liberation of France. So liberation of North Africa is in November of 1942. Then you get the liberation of Italy in 1943, liberation of France in 1944, and the atomic bombing of Japan in 1945. And of course, Japan isn't even in the European theater anyways, so that wouldn't be an answer to this question. But question 7, the pivotal battle in the Pacific where the U.S. was able to destroy most of Japan's aircraft carriers, setting the stage for America's island hopping campaign, was the Battle of Midway. Question 8. The U.S. federal government had all the following roles in World War II except, so did it help plan and ration goods? Yep. The Manhattan Project? Yep. Historically low tax rates on the wealthy? No, the opposite. Very high tax rates. And then the Japanese internment camps? Yes, unfortunately. Question 9. All of the following groups of Americans witnessed greater employment opportunities during World War II except, let's see, Americans who had been chronically unemployed during the Great Depression. Yes, there was tons of demand for unskilled labor, even people with gaps in their employment record. So all those people came flooding back into the workforce. Companies were desperate to hire anyone, basically. So it gave a lot of Americans good experience, a good foot in the door again. Japanese Americans, no, they were in the internment camps, so that's the exception. Women, yes. African Americans, yes. Question 10. In which area during World War II did African Americans achieve desegregation? In war industries, subject to FDR's Fair Employment Practices Committee. Yes, this one. But not in armed forces, not in Southern public schools, not in Southern restaurants and buses. It wouldn't be till 1948, where Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces after World War II. Wouldn't be until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and afterwards that, and really not until 1957, when finally the first high school, in Little Rock, Arkansas, actually implements the decision to desegregate Southern public schools. And it wasn't really until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act that Southern restaurants and buses would be desegregated. We'll get more into that in this week's lesson on the turbulent 1960s. All right, so let's submit and see how I did. Yep, 10 out of 10. Okay. And lesson 11, the one we just did on the 1950s. So among the root causes of the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II were the Korean War, yep. The Soviet Union's perceived unwillingness to allow free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, yep. The division of Germany into West Germany and East Germany, yep. All these answers combined, yep. Truman's policy of containment called for the U.S. to put a strict cap on the military budget. No. There was tons of military spending during this time period. Not quite at World War II levels, but much more than America had ever spent. Even a much larger percentage of our economy than the U.S. had ever spent during what was at least nominally peacetime for much of this Cold War. So that's not it. Prevent the further spread of communism through covert operations and or military intervention. Yes. So preventing the further spread of communism. And whether that meant the U.S. should use covert operations, to overthrow communist governments or, stop communist governments from coming to power or, militarily intervene if need be. All those were on the table, like in the Korean War and in the Vietnam War. Return to the isolationism of the 20s and 30s? No, definitely not. Use aggressive military action to overthrow communist governments in Eastern Europe? No, that would be going too far, risking World War III with the Soviet Union. Question 3. In the late 1940s, Truman managed to push through Congress all of the following fair deal legislation, except, let's see, was there an expansion of Social Security? Yes. Slight increase in the minimum wage? Yes. An end to all federal funding of roads and highways? Nope. That's the exception. And in fact, Eisenhower then right afterwards expands the federal funding for highways even more. National Housing Act? Yes. Let's see. Question 4. Which of the following most accurately describes the immediate cause and outcome of the Korean War? It would be basically North Korean forces entered South Korea, and eventually the U.S. intervened, and the war ended in a stalemate between North Korea and Chinese volunteers on the one side. I say volunteers because they, of course, had everyone, like historians there's a pretty strong consensus that the actual Chinese government was helping these volunteers with artillery and rifles and ammunition and whatnot. So you had them on the one side, and American, UN, and South Korean forces on the other side. And it was a stalemate because Truman didn't want to extend the war to China, which probably would have been needed to win the war decisively. That might have brought the Soviet Union into the war, because both the Soviet Union and China were communist at this time. So, question 5. All of the following factors facilitated the growth of suburbs in the 1950s, except... So did a rise in automobile ownership help? Yes. Low interest mortgages? Yes. Increasing desire among white American families to live in racially integrated communities? No, that would not have been a factor to cause suburbs to grow, because suburbs were not racially integrated. They were actually almost always racially segregated. And was there the Highway Act? Yes, that made it easier to get to the suburbs. Question 6. The increase in the birth rate, known as the baby boom, produced a unique generation. Yep, definitely. A new market for advertisers. Yep. Heightened anxieties over youth culture and rock and roll. Yep. So actually all these answers combine. Question 7, the so-called beatniks promoted which values that they saw as lacking in 1950s American culture? The spontaneity and creativity. They felt like 1950s culture was already too conformist and obedient. They felt like the affluence and consumerism didn't really make up for that, or, wasn't a good enough of a benefit to compensate for the drawbacks of the conformity and obedience. And they also tended to not really be huge fans of what you might call the sexual modesty and domesticity expected of women, especially middle class women in the 1950s. They would be, housewives and be not adventurous in their dating habits and whatnot. As you probably saw in those film clips, the expectations conveyed in those, that everything was supposed to be prim and proper. Question 8. The U.S. economy in the 1950s experienced which of the following? Would it be high unemployment rates? No. In fact, low unemployment rates. High tax rates on the wealthy? Yes. Low rates of unionization? No. In fact, the highest rates of unionization in American history. Technological backwardness compared to the rest of the world? No. The exact opposite. So part of how the U.S. is able to get away with high tax rates on the wealthy is that our companies had the best technology, so they could pay high union wages and high taxes and still make high profits at the same time. They could, you could have the best of all worlds because of that technological edge, which the U.S. then starts to lose in the 1970s. Where after that point, it seems like companies have to start making trade-offs, or else they can't compete profitably with other companies around the world. They have the benefit of lower wages. They have access to the same technology now, whether legally or illegally. There's a lot of talk about China, stealing patents and producing stuff in their factories that they're not supposed to. But if you combine same technology with lower wages, that's a big advantage. And then you've got other countries that may not have such low wages, but if they have lower taxes, that can be an attractive thing for businesses. So yeah. Question 9. All of the following factors helped produce the second Red Scare in the U.S. in the early 1950s, except let's see, Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism, losing China to communism, the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons. So it's actually all of these answers combined. And actually, I might need to reword this question because in hindsight, it's a little misleading where I say except. I should just say which factors help produce. Yeah, but all of these factors combine to produce the Red Scare. And question 10. Between 1950 and 1980, the U.S. government helped overthrow governments in all of the following countries, except for Cuba, where the U.S. was unsuccessful in overthrowing Fidel Castro and the communists there. The U.S. did attempt it with the Bay of Pigs invasion, but where they armed exiles to overthrow that government, but that invasion failed. And John F. Kennedy escalated at the last second from escalating it, or from devoting the American Air Force to support that invasion, which would have entwined the U.S. even more into a war in Cuba. It might have touched off World War III, who knows? Um, but in any case, that is where the U.S. was unsuccessful in overthrowing governments. These other three, the U.S. was successful. In Iran in 1953 to overthrow their elected government that wanted to nationalize American-owned oil assets. Chile, 1973, where a socialist government was elected. And Guatemala, 1954, where a reformist, maybe quasi-socialist government was elected that wanted to redistribute foreign-owned land to poor peasants, including land owned by American investors. So Cuba is the answer there. And 10 out of 10. All right. So I hope you found that useful. If you're getting ready to do your Unit 3, either the essay part, which is due anytime on your own before December 6th. That part doesn't need to be proctored. Or if you're getting ready to do the multiple choice part, which of course does need to be proctored, and hopefully you've figured out, made some rough plans by now maybe of if you're going to do that on your own or you're going to go to one of the testing centers to do that. But yeah, I hope this helped a little bit, and wish you the best of luck on the Unit 3 exam and the proctored event. Signing off.